Parshat Mishpatim begins in chapter 21, Perek Chaf Aleph. Now, what's unique in the beginning of the Parsha is that it actually seems out of order. The end of last week's Parsha was the Aseret HaDibrot, the Ten Commandments, and the giving of the Torah. The end of this week's Parsha is the continuation of that story. And in the midst, we have an insertion of a whole list of seemingly random mitzvahs put together, or even odder, not necessarily mitzvahs, really, but a whole array of laws that seem not to be in place right here. So we'll try and address that a little bit. For the first chapter 21 and really all the way through chapter 20, midway of 22 are social laws. And then midway of 22 all the way to the end of verse 20 in chapter 23 are really like political structure laws. And then it goes back into what was the conversation beforehand, the giving of the Torah, the Ten Commandments. And at Shishi, we get a promise about the fulfillment of humanity and the fulfillment of the world and the fulfillment of Hashem's promise to us about the land. And then chapter 24 is the continuation of the giving of the Torah. So really, the end of last week's Parsha, which is the giving of the Torah at Sinai, and the end of this week's Parsha, really continuation. In the middle, we have the insertion of these Mishpatim, these social structure laws, and the promise of fulfillment and of the promise of the land and the fulfillment of each individual person's destiny and ability to live out their days in fulfillment. So we're going to try and go through some, or at least a quick list of all of the mishpatim, these social structure laws that we find in this week's parsha, and hopefully make a little bit of sense of them. Also, we hopefully will get to pay a debt to Kathy and Chris about what is the meaning of kishuf, of magic or black magic, etc., which was asked about how the Egyptians did what they did and what the meaning is in this week's parsha, where there is the prohibition against it. So let's take a look. The pasuk begins, chapter 21, 1, Chaf Aleph, Aleph, Ve'eleh ha'mishpatim asher tasim lefneim. These are the mishpatim, if you would, statutes or social structure laws that you will place before them. Rashi points out that the beginning of the parsha begins with an odd word, and these. These, Rashi says, is usually in contradistinction to those, to what was. These, separate. And is a connector. So, and these says, this is different, but this too is the same as the other. Very unique introduction. And that will give us a hint into what's going on here, because we're in the middle of the giving of the Torah. The Ten Commandments are stated. Moshe comes to the Bnei Yisrael, and at the end of this week's parsha is a continuation of that, where Hashem says, tell the people, teach it to them. He teaches to them, gives them the Torah in writing, and they say, Na'aseh v'nishma, we shall do, and we shall heed or hear. So that's all at the end of this week's parsha, and then in the middle we get this idea, and here's an idea that the Torah wants to introduce to us. When we think of the will of Hashem, often we think of, okay, so something spiritual or a particular relationship with the divine. But if we look at the Ten Commandments, besides for the first few, which were bein Adam lamakom, as we call them, between the human and Hashem, We have the second half, or the last few of the Ten Commandments, are really between people, right? Do not murder, no adultery, no stealing, kidnapping, false testimony, coveting. And as we mentioned last week, coveting is actually not even between two people, because what difference does it make to anybody if I'm jealous of them? It really, the prohibition of coveting is for myself, because what does it do to me? It ruins my own self, a sense of self, of who I am and what I need, and my dignity and my value. So it really is negative to the self. Here, the Torah says, ve'eleh, and these as well. And these too are a part of Torah, a part of your Hashem's perspective of how you should live your life. Social structures, social commandments, social obligations. Where if we look at these, we could think of them as really not the purview of religion, not the purview of relationship with Hashem. In fact, for generations, people have mocked the Talmudic study, the Torah study that are done in yeshivas, right? You're studying about if an ox gores an ox is the typical mocking of the yeshiva studies. Oh, you're learning Shor Shanogach Hazapara. If an ox gored another ox, who's responsible for what? Come on, that's not Torah. That's not important. Why don't you study something important? But the truth is, the Torah is saying over here, this understanding of the structure and the value of the world from the perspective of Hashem is a part of the Torah. It is in the midst of the giving of the Torah, in the midst of Har Sinai, we must understand that all of what relates to the world, if we're going to live a life of emulating the ways of Hashem, just as Hashem is gracious and kind and compassionate, so too we must adopt and learn those attributes. And if we are going to understand how to help people and bring people up, and if that's the mission that we are going to have, to create a society and to create a culture and to create a way of life of bringing people to an elevated state and living ourselves in an elevated state, we must see every aspect of our life as a part of the purview of relationship with Hashem, within the view of how Hashem sees it. So ve'eleh hamishpatim asher tasim lifneim, you will place these before him, and not just place them bifneihem. Make sure that people not only can state a law, but can internalize the meaning and the basis for that, so that the dignity of the self and the dignity of others will be elevated through this. So to understand this, let's take a look at the first few sets of laws. The first set of laws pertain to slavery, servitude, indentured servitude. And if you think about it, like if we're going to start with, okay, here's some way to live an elevated life, that's the last one you would pick, right? It's like, let's start social justice and social and social way of living with the laws of indentured servitude. But the truth of the matter is, that's precisely what we're trying to do, to try and see the dignity in each person. As Rashi points out from the Talmud, it says over here, if someone gets sold into slavery, when does that happen? If somebody has broken the law, they stole and cannot pay it back. So in our society, and for 1,000 years in Europe and for longer in other places, so we punish the person either cutting off their hand or locking them up in prison or worse, right? And what does that do? Nothing. It ruins that person, gives them no sense of ability to redeem themselves. They are either now incapable of making money on their own because they're missing a hand, or they've been locked up together with other criminals for long enough that that's all they've learned. So the Torah says, okay, here's what you need to do. This person who stole and cannot pay back gets to live in a family with obligations to the family. And that person will now learn the reward of diligent work of themselves, but it can only last 6 years. And at the end of 6 years, they have to be set free. This concept of, instead of isolating criminals together with each other so they learn from themselves, from each other, you put them into a family setting, you put them into a structure, you put them into somewhere where they're going to work to redeem themselves. Give them the opportunity to become dignified people. Elsewhere, not in this pasuk, when it deals with this again, the Torah says, "Ki tov lo imach," it will be good for him with you. And as the Talmud says, you have to treat him as you treat yourself. If you have a blanket, he needs a blanket. If he has a pillow, if you have a pillow, he needs a pillow. That idea of teaching someone the dignity of themselves, but keeping them obligated to making a difference, to sustaining themselves. That's the dignity that the Torah wants to even when someone's has struggled, and even when someone, as far as societal norms, we would say they are on the lower rungs. That's where the Torah begins with and says, no, that person needs to be given the opportunities to raise themselves up and the trust to and the structure to become a person within society. And the next one says that if there is an impoverished girl, and she too must have the dignity of marriage, where someone would treat her just as they would treat anyone else. The clothing and food and marital relations must be given to her in the same way that any other woman. And if you can't live up to that, then you can't have her as a wife. This tells us that the beginning of Mishpatim is that the lowest, the least able to defend themselves, or the least, maybe the least desirable as far as social structure desirables go, right? We have to elevate them and give them the opportunities to be treated with dignity and to be shown the reward of that treatment of dignity. Then the Torah deals with the manslaughterer, someone who kills inadvertently, that we must save that person as well. This is someone who has done perhaps one of the most atrocious things, inadvertently, but has, it seems like you cannot come back from that. That's something that you cannot, you cannot redeem yourself from. The Torah says, no, that person must be given protection and must be saved because it was inadvertent. And by contrast, when someone does murder intentionally, willingly, knowingly, that person does not deserve to continue to live amongst you, even if the person they murdered was a slave. Something that no other society had until now, right? That you kill someone who is of a lower society, you kill someone who is a slave, and you get away with it. The Torah says, no, that human being is a human as well. And includes with that the dignity of and honor of parents, one who strikes a parent, or curses a parent, or someone who kidnaps, steals another person. This was a way of becoming a slave, was where people would then steal someone and sell them off. And then their only release was if they would then work enough to release themselves. So that is tantamount to murder. So again, the social structure that the Torah is teaching here is that we have to give each human dignity and give them the opportunity to live up to it. But they can ruin it for themselves if they even kill a slave, or even if they strike a slave and injure a slave. That too is considered an injury. That slave is then by default emancipated, even if their own so quote unquote owner hurts them, any injury, and and that person doesn't deserve to be in the if we would custodian, as we talked about earlier, the responsibility of giving a person in their servitude an opportunity to grow and become a responsible person in society. If one mistreats that person, then they are not worthy of that responsibility and that opportunity. Then the Torah, we're in 18 now, 21:18. If people fight, that's not that's a given. That struggles happen within a society. But if someone injures someone in that struggle, they are held responsible. And here the Torah gives multiple structures for that. There's the damages to the person. There's the loss of work. There's the medical bills, as well as we'll see the injury itself. Elsewhere, the Torah tells us about the shame that is caused, the emotional pain that is caused. That too has punitive damages that one would have to pay. But here the Torah says the responsibility is someone who injures someone else. And here the Torah is teaching that you have to take responsibility for your actions, although these, this was the spur of the moment. This was something that I was antagonized. You have to take responsibility for your actions. The injury to someone else is your responsibility. And the Torah throws in something, v'rapo yirape, and you shall surely heal him. And the Talmud says, the Gemara says, mitkan shnitin rishus l'rofe l'rape. From here, we have permission for a doctor to heal. And a lot has been said about what is the meaning here. Some take it to mean that perhaps one would have thought that you have no right to heal an ailment. Leave that to the healer of all beings. Rofei chol basar. We had a couple of weeks ago, Hashem promises if you live up to the Torah, the Mitzvah, then all the ailments that came onto Mitzrayim, I shall not bring onto you. Ki ani Hashem rofe'echa, because I am Hashem, your healer. So perhaps here as well, somebody's injured, somebody has a wound or an injury or something, Hashem should heal. And the Torah says, no, that's not our way. Our way is that you have to take you have to take your responsibility of doing your part in being healthy and keeping yourself and society healthy. And if you cause somebody else injury, to then take responsibility for that. So others say that the meaning here is that a doctor is allowed to charge for their healing. It may be, right? We could think that, look, life-saving, saving a life is an obligation. If you have the ability to save a life, you must do so. And so if you know how to save a life, how can you charge someone for it? Here the Torah gives that ability, as the Torah is clearly stating that the person has to pay for the medical bills. Either way, the concept here is, again, a societal norm of that we must take our own care into our hands. Obviously, we recognize the providence, the hashgacha from HaKadosh Baruch Hu in our lives that brings us bracha and gives success to the doctors and to the medicine that we take. As the Rambam, great physician, the famous prayer tefillah, the Rambam that he has for a doctor to say that, let the work of my hands be successful. It is through you, Hashem. But we must do our part. We must act. And that even though it is a communal obligation, it is also to care for each other. It is also an obligation of those receiving the medicine to pay and to sustain the practice of medicine, to allow it to be there for everyone. So very interesting ideas of the social obligations to each other and responsibility for each other. The next section is well known and misrepresented, and so I think it needs a few moments. Verse 22 through 25. If people are fighting and somebody strikes a pregnant woman and she loses the pregnancy, so there is punitive damages. If there's also if someone dies unintentionally, not the person that they were going after, it's a form of manslaughter. Then there's punitive damages again for the unintended murder. And there it says nefesh v'nasata, and you will give nefesh tachas nefesh, a soul to replace the soul, tachas nefesh. Now, there, since you're giving, it is clear that it is financial giving. You're paying for the value of that soul. The punitive damages of these. Now, there obviously is no value to a human being. So that's the punitive means only. You cannot give a soul, but you can give the replacement of that soul, the loss to that family. And then it says an eye, the replacement of an eye. A tooth, the replacement of a tooth. Yad, a hand, the replacement of a hand. It is translated usually to be an eye for an eye, but that's not what it says. The Hebrew does not say ayin be'ayin or ayin la'ayin. It says ayin tachas ayin. The replacement. Now, clearly it does not mean you cut off one person's hand to replace the others, because that's not a replacement. And as the Gemara says and Rambam writes, it never was there a Jewish court that ruled an eye for an eye. The Torah never meant that, and it was never said to be that. And the Gemara in Volcano has a list of proofs from the Torah that it does not mean. It never meant. It was never meant to mean that. Rather, it always meant, like the verse beforehand, that means nefesh tachas nefesh. But there it says v'nasata, and you will give. It's clearly about a payment, a statement, a giving over by hand of the payment. So the context is clear here, and clear in the other places the Torah says is that it does not mean and never meant the giving of the loss of an eye to as a punishment for losing an eye, etc. So it's just a mistranslation. It never meant that. Nevertheless, Seforno and others ask, why did the Torah say it in a way that seems that could at least be misinterpreted that way? But it seems like that this is in the replacement of that eye. It should just say pay for the damages of the eye, pay punitive damages for the loss of the eye. And that, as Seforno says, is to tell you that in reality, you have forfeited your right to that which you've taken from someone else. And that's a very powerful idea about the responsibility we have to others. That we forfeit our right to what we have when we take that or damage someone else's. We take it for granted that we live in a society that people are constantly taking. I don't know if it was better in other societies or in other eras, because I didn't live that. But I have a sense, because I've seen it in different places. I lived in Yerushalayim, in smaller communities, where there is a sense of communal obligation to each other, where even though I have my own shops and I have my own business and I have my own things, that we do see the value of, while I take care of myself, to make sure that others are taken care of as well. But I think society has come to a place that, for the most part, it's survival of the fittest. And we try and take more than we're willing to help others succeed. And that's important to recognize, that when we take from someone else, when we destroy something that belongs to someone else, or someone else has, we could be forfeiting our own rights to that very thing. This is a powerful reminder of that responsibility. Somebody asked a question. Let me just see what it said. So the question is, how do we assess any of these things? How do you assess the value of an eye? So it's not only the value of the surgery, because that's separate, because the Torah had said, you have to pay for the medical bills. And it's not only the loss of work, because that's already there in verse 19, Rak shiv to yiten. You have to give the loss of work as well. There's a punitive assessment of sort of the value of what a person could produce in their life, and what they, we have assessments like that as well. When there's a wrongful death suit, right? So how do we come up with the numbers? Right? So the Gemara gives some certain ways to look at it, and the Gemara struggles with that as well. One way versus another way. Say, for instance, if somebody causes someone the loss of an arm, the Gemara suggests perhaps what an equivalent person would be willing to take as in such an injury. But it's hard for people to assess anything like that. So it's not an easy assessment, and I'm sure in today's jurisprudence we have the same thing. We have civil suits over a wrongful death or injuries from something that whether a car accident or anything else, and those are assessed at. Try and assess it based on what potential of that person was and what they did, and the pain and suffering and so on. It's not an easy assessment, but the idea is that a person should recognize that they have taken something of such an intrinsic value of someone else, that in a certain sense they have forfeited their right to the benefit of their own such usage, and then they have to redeem that. The Torah continues with the obligations of one's possessions and one's actions. So if you own an animal and your animal injures or destroys, whether it injures someone else's animal, or injures someone else's property, or injures someone else as another person, that responsibility, again, belongs to you. It is our responsibility to take care of that which is ours. And the Torah adds, even if it's not an animal, not something that actually belongs to us financially, but it's something that we've done, whether it's making a hole in the ground, or digging, and then somebody or something falls into there, whether it's a fire that we start, or our animals are let loose and destroy someone else's field. So included in that is theft. If we have someone who has stolen, so then they pay back double of what they took. That's the punitive penalty for stealing. And if they then destroyed that which they stole, then there's a 4 or 5 time punitive penalty. And in the midst of talking about theft, the Torah then also puts in the right of someone to defend themselves when somebody is armed coming into their home, where they have a reasonable right to fear for their own life. That's at the beginning of chapter 22. The Torah then goes into an interesting responsibility we have to each other, and responsibility we have to protection of someone else's property. In chapter 22, verse 6, 7, and through 9, 12, really through 14 actually, there are 4 levels or 4 types of responsibility that you have to take for someone else's property. Shomer China, someone who is protecting or watching someone else's property for free, just as a friend, and their responsibility for negligence. Then a paid custodian, someone who gets a benefit for watching someone else's property, that they are responsible even for theft and loss. Someone who rents, and someone who borrows. If someone borrows, they're responsible for anything that happens unless it was used in the typical way and the normal way that it was used. Included in this is the Torah says if somebody were to take an oath that they did not misuse that which they were protecting or watching or custodian over, and it turns out that they did, either they stole the item or misused the item, that they would have to also repay double of what it is they took and be responsible for that which was taken. So it went from the responsibility to other humans and responsibility for our actions to the pain and suffering and injury to other humans, to the responsibility to others through our actions, our possessions actions, and our responsibility to other people's possessions. Here, the Torah takes a shift in our responsibility to social protection and to social to a society that is elevated and proper. Verse 15 talks about statutory rape, the liability of someone to pay for the pain and suffering of statutory rape, and the responsibility to that young girl as well. And again, this is about protecting the vulnerable in the society, as well as holding people responsible for their actions, even where it would seem consenting, but that doesn't count as consent on account of the age of that child. The next 2 verses seem juxtaposed oddly, and they deal with machashefa, a sorceress or sorcery, and bestiality. The juxtaposition is somewhat telling, and this comes into the question that Kathy and Chris had asked previously, just to talk a little bit about the concept of sorcery, magic, black magic, from the Torah's perspective. So there's a great discussion between Rambam and Ramban. Rambam says that there is no such thing as magic at all. Ramban says that there is a concept of magic. Try to address both opinions, but I want to talk a little bit about just a perspective of how to see what's going on and what it means. So, every one of my children has had the great opportunity of having the homework of creating a volcano, right? So how do you create a volcano at home? You all know this, right? You create the mountain out of paper mache or whatever it may be, and then you take a liquid that we could call, I don't know, water. You can take white powder, maybe we'd call it salt or lime, back when, 5, 6, 7, 800 years ago, and we combine them and it just blows up, right? So if you don't know what substances you have, and you don't know how they negatively interact with something else, that looks like magic. So Rabbeinu Bachya Ibn Pekuda, 11th, 12th century in Alsace and in Provence and France, says, if we understand the nature of the world, we have to appreciate that there are many things in nature of the world that were meant to go together and many things that are meant not to go together. And when they go together, they become destructive, altering in a way that's inappropriate. Can they go together? Yes. Do we always immediately see the destruction it brings? No. But that's the nature of it. It's destructive by its very nature. We can understand that physically. We can understand that two components, when they come together, that's what they do. That's how they interact. Whether it's creating steam by putting saline onto a magnesium pad, and that's the way you create these self-heating meals, right? So that's a good use of two components that don't necessarily mix well together, but because you've mixed them and utilize it, that's a constructive thing. But I can do the same thing where it becomes destructive, where it becomes explosive, becomes negative. When somebody, so Rambam understands that's all that's going on in black magic, in sorcery. It's just tapping into understanding nature to the degree that those around you don't, and manipulating it in a way that can be destructive or constructive. And by doing that, it's like, voila, look at me. I'm the most powerful sorcerer because I can make this volcano happen, just by adding water and, lime dust, right? I don't have to tell you what those substances are, and it looks like that. Or I can be constructive by creating, heating the food by just pouring water onto a pad, and it happens to be, saline or magnesium pad, right? The idea is utilizing nature either to destroy or to build. Ramban, Nachmanides, a generation or two after Rambam, also from Spain, more 12th century, late 12th century. So Ramban says that just as we understand that there are very tangible physical things that are interact negatively, there are less tangible things that also by nature would interact in ways that we cannot necessarily see. So from a purely scientific physical way, we would say in quantum mechanics, if you connect two atoms, two protons, and they have them spinning one way, and then I separate them, and one is the other, halfway around the world, and I change the rotation of the one here. It's connected. One halfway around the world will also change its direction, right? So I don't know anything about quantum mechanics, but that's the way it works, as it were. And so if I can manipulate things that at that distance, or change things in that way, that is sorcery, magic. I'm manipulating the world to affect things myself. In a modern way, in modern time questions, we would have the understanding of usage of cloning right? The dangers of cloning would be inappropriate if we're using it in a destructive way, or even though it may look constructive, but we don't know what the outcome is, and so that would be destructive. And then if we try and manipulate the world, but in a constructive way, because we want to grow a heart from, in a lab, or to regenerate certain blood cells or cells to heal people from certain ailments, we understand that that's a good thing. And so that's the idea of building from the world, or utilizing the nature within the world to be destructive. And Ramban says that this is true on a spiritual level, even more than a physical level. So in physics, we can sometimes see directly what it is we're doing. But when we play with things that are metaphysical, such as we think the value of cloning a human, or the destruction of cloning a human, that's not only a physical question. That's where this prohibition would step in, would become relevant. So the idea of mechashefa, of understanding the manipulations within the structure of the world. And these commentators say that's the juxtaposition why mechashefa, kishuf, sorcery, is placed right near, or immediately what follows after is bestiality, because the understanding that that's just the inappropriate, a dangerous and wrong combination of utilizing aspects of nature in a way that ought not be there. The next halachas deal with those that are in society, but are most easily or most likely to be taken advantage of. The foreigner, the Torah says, do not lotono v'lo, don't oppress them, but even more, the Torah says, don't even offend them with your words. A very high bar to keep people, the sensitivity, and we talked about this last week by Yisro, the sensitivity to how my words can affect negatively someone else, and to cause them pain, and to be careful of the people that are most vulnerable, whether it's the foreigner in Pasuk Chaf in verse 20, or Almana v'Yasim Latanu in 21, a widow and an orphan. And the Torah says, I will hear their pain, I will respond to their pain. Verse 24 is another level of responsibility, of social responsibility to each other. Im kesef talve es ami, if you were to lend money to my nation. The Torah, the Gemara says this is one of the places where if is an obligation. And it only says it in if because not everybody can afford to lend. But everybody has the responsibility of lending, to take care of ha'ani imach, that the poor person should be with you, elevated to your status, to your level, to be kept afloat together with you. And to do so, you must lend money. And as you would to someone who is your own flesh and blood, you must do so without charging interest. Now, although that's a loss, there's a loss in lending money because my money has potential growth, and my money, and in your hands, there's a potential loss. I may never see it again. Nevertheless, that's how we keep each other afloat. That's the responsibility we have to each other. Very powerful thing. The Torah takes it one step further. And when you take care of the poor amongst you by lending them, so you're going to take collateral, you're going to take something from their home and say, okay, here's what I'm going to hold of yours until you repay it. In verse 25, it's so you're going to take their clothing, or you're going to take an item. They're poor. They don't have much. So what are you going to take from them? Their pillow? Make sure to give it back at night because that's the only pillow they have. They need it. So what are you going to take? You're going to take maybe their coat overnight. Make sure to bring it back to them in the morning, and you'll take the pillow again. That's the responsibility of taking care of someone that you need collateral, but you also have to make sure that their dignity and what they need to live is maintained. It's a responsibility that the Torah wants us to understand. So taken all together, in the midst of the giving of the Torah, an entire structure of social laws, of our responsibility to ourselves, our responsibility to each other, our responsibility to those that are most vulnerable, our responsibility to those that have actually done wrong, to give them a chance to elevate themselves and redeem themselves, and to treat each person, regardless of at what level they're at in societal hierarchies, if you would, to give each person the dignity within there and that protection within there. And that protection is the next section, which is the political structure that has to be built upon ethics of care and kindness to everybody. But it requires the understanding that where it all comes from is from Hashem. And the first mitzvah, or the first recognition in verse 27 is, don't curse God. And this is the idea that if we have to understand that there are things that even when we're frustrated, there's something greater than me that I must be able to live within that structure. When there is no hierarchy, when everything's equal, things fall apart. Because people have differences of opinion, and people have different directions they want to go. So if we don't have somewhere to look to that ultimately we decide this is how we're going to settle it, the result is that it leads to chaos, and often the worst elements become the head. The worst elements are the ones that become the leaders. And so Elokim l'sakalit. Don't curse that which the Torah has given us. Don't curse Hashem. And nasi ba'amcha lo tar, and even the leader in your community. And here's a very powerful thing, because if we're going to have a social structure that will work, then we have to agree to work within that structure. The legitimate claims of the French Revolution led to what it led, right? We understand that some things, even if we disagree with it, remain important as a structure to maintain, and we have to, within that structure, create the advancement and betterment of the people and each individual. And that's this idea of the political structure, that you cannot curse the leader, rather you have to affect the change from within, which means your own responsibilities to the people within the structure. That's verse 28, your responsibilities to your obligations. And the care, all the way down to the care of the lowest. And here, it's interesting that the Torah puts in the responsibility to kindness to an animal right in there. And so too to your animals. That's the idea, that the structure has to go from the top with a respect for that all the way down to the lowest. Everything has to work in a system that's responsible and caring. And so this mitzvah is there. And then the next is that responsibility to self. And you shall be yourself people of holiness. And as a concrete way of living in holiness, don't eat terefa, which is the idea of roadkill, animal that is ill, sickly, and dying. These three verses teach us the responsibility to the respect within the society, to protection of all aspects of society, and to the holiness and dignity of self. Chapter 23 begins, Chaf Gimel begins with the responsibility or the obligations of righteousness to be upheld by the leaders. They're don't join up with evil people to be leaders. Follow majority rule. So take into account even the poor, but don't bend the law on behalf of the poor or against the poor. Even those that are not your friend, you have to protect their animals and help them out, which is verses 4 and 5. And stay away from anything false. Midavar sheker tirchak. Remain distant from anything false. And don't take bribes. In the societal structure, make sure to protect the foreigner, the ger. You understand more than anyone else the soul of the ger. Make sure that they are protected. And the next two psukim, the next two structures are the 6 years of the land and the 7th year fallow, and the 6 days of work and the Shabbos resting. That shows up elsewhere in the Torah, but if we look at these two psukim, here it comes up in a manner of protecting the poor and the workers. It doesn't say it so much for your obligation, but rather, as you look in verse 11, v'achlu evyonei amecha, so that this way you can allow the poor to have access to real property, to the fields. And you will work 6 days and rest on the 7th, so that your animals and your servants and the foreigner can rest as well. So here it's not because of Shabbos for the sake of Shabbos and Shemitah, the 7th fallow year for the sake of Shemitah, but for the sake of those in your society that are poor and needed. And then it goes into the obligations of society to Hashem and to the spiritual side, which is the holidays, the Chagim, the obligation of the pilgrimage going up to Yerushalayim, and the obligations of bringing of the first fruit and of the carbon. And in that structure is do not mix milk and meat. This comes up 3 times in Torah. Hopefully next time we'll have time to address that. But it's interesting, and both times, but 2 out of the 3 times it shows up in this context, in the context of the Chagim and our obligations of our first fruit and obligations to the spiritual, social side of our community. I want to, in the last few minutes, just get to the next section. After Shishi, the 6th Aliyah, Hashem says, Hine, and this is verse 20 in chapter 23. Hine anochi shaleach malach lefanecha l'shomrecha baderech. I'm sending an angel to lead you, a presence of the divine amongst you to be your guide. And you have to understand that Shmi Bekirba, that within the structure of the guidance of Am Yisrael, there is a presence of my name is within them. It means that there's the presence, the essence of our relationship with Hashem is in that guidance that Hashem brings us. And as a result of our service of Hashem, of our relationship with Hashem within that, verse 25, you will serve Hashem your God, who will bless your bread and your water, and remove any ailment from amongst us. This is the blessing of living within the recognition that there is a divine providence, there is a divine hashgacha and a guidance within our life. 26 through 33 takes it one step further. It says that in verse 26, Es mispar yamecha amale, the count of your days I will fill. What a tremendous blessing to have our days filled and counting and valuable, to be able to have every day of our life count and be meaningful and be a meaningful, a purposeful living, and to be fulfilled in that. And as a result of that, if you're able to live that way, the bracha is going to bring more bracha, the complete dwelling within the land of Eretz Yisrael, all the way up to the complete borders of the land. So that's the section through 33. Chapter 24 goes back to the giving of Sinai. Here we have the famous words of Na'aseh v'nishma. I will, in verse 7, it says over there, Vayikach Sefer HaBris, took the scroll of the covenant. This is the first mention of the Torah being written in this scroll. Vayikra b'azneim, and read it to the people. Vayomru kol asher diber Hashem na'aseh v'nishma. And the people said, we will do, and then they said, we will listen. The commitment to do, even before they have heard all the obligation, the recognition of the value and the relationship with Hashem, so solidified that there is a commitment to do even before receiving all the commandments. The next section of verses 9, 10, and 11 are cryptic at least, but it does mention the recognition of sapphire as the foothold or the footstool of Hashem, and seeing that. And if we can just for a moment see that the sapphire is this clear stone of blue, which represents the heavens. Our recognition that Hashem in the heaven is guiding is amongst us, and our actions are a result of that relationship. Verse 12 is the last I want to point out, because I think this is crucial to understanding the Torah. Vayomer Hashem al Moshe. This is in chapter 24, verse 12. Vayomer Hashem al Moshe, and Hashem says to Moshe, Alei Elai, come up to me, Hahara, to the mountain, V'heyeh shama, you shall be there. Ve'etin alacha, and I shall give to you, as haluchas ha'evan, the stones of tablet, V'hatorah, and the Torah, V'hamitzvah, and the mitzvah, Asher kasafti lahorosam, which I have written as for teaching them. Now, this is a lot of words, but we have to make sense of it. Hashem says to Moshe, come up to the mountain, and there I will give to you the tablets of stone. We understand that. That's the Aseres HaDibros, what we call the 10 Commandments, the 10 statements from Hashem that we learned last week that were given on Sinai. That's the tablets of stone. V'hatorah, what's that? And the Torah. So you understand, that's the written word. V'hamitzvah, and the mitzvah. How is that different than the Torah? That is included in the Torah, is it not? And then it says, which I have written to teach them. Yeah. Lehorosam, in order to teach them. What does that mean? Here the Torah tells us the structure of the Torah. There are the 10 Commandments. There is the Aseres HaDibros. There is the written Torah, V'hatorah. But you cannot act from the Torah. The Torah itself will not give you a sufficient information to know how to do the mitzvah. That's separate. That's the oral Torah, which tells you how to interpret and to act on every single one of the verses of the Torah. That's V'hamitzvah. And the commandment, the oral Torah. And the Torah says, so then why is there a written Torah? Asher kasavti, that which I have written, lahorosam, that's a teaching tool. It's the shorthand of the mitzvah. So it says in the Torah, and you shall write it on your doorpost. What does that mean? It doesn't give you all the details. You write it on a parchment with black ink on leather, right? On a piece of parchment. What shall you write? The Shema and the V'ahavta. And you put it on the doorpost. Which doorpost? The right one on your entryway. Where? Third of the way from the top. That's the mitzvah. That's not written in the Torah. But the Torah is written in a way that it is a tool for the mitzvah. It's written so that it is a teaching tool for the mitzvah, that from there you have the rest of the mitzvah, but the information is not in the mitzvah itself. The Torah is, the written Torah is, without the oral Torah, the written Torah is a meaningless text. The only way, one second, the only way to access the text itself is through the ha-mitzvah, and they come together, they were taught together.
Two things. One is a question, one is an interesting analogy that I heard, that the written and the oral Torah, that it's like when you go to a lecture in a high school or a college classroom, the written Torah is the equivalent of the PowerPoint slides, and the oral part is what the teacher's saying. So, you take down your bullet points, but obviously there's more to unpack amongst each bullet point.
Right, and that's what would be the term of the end of this, what it says at the end of this pasuk, Asher kasavti, that which I wrote, lahorosam, is to teach them. That's the teaching tool. Very accurate to this verse itself, correct.
And then a quick question, I don't know if it's a quick question, but what would be the reasoning why, if the oral Torah is just as important, if not maybe even more important than the written Torah, why wasn't it written? What's the benefit of, is it too long for God or Moshe to write it down?
The purpose, well, it is a long question, but in short, the purpose of the Torah is for teaching. If you can just pick up a book and read it, then it's not Torah, then it's not actual teaching. Teaching comes from a teacher to a student. So you need to have the teaching structure, but you need the instructor with it. And that relationship between teacher and student, between passing it on from one generation to the next, midor lador, from vigad to lemin, to be able to tell that and to check in with the elders. Ask your elders and they will tell you. And Shema bani musar avicha v'al titash Torah zamecha, listen to the discipline of your mother and the teaching of your father. That requires that there's actually a story, a oral statement from one person to the next. Now, it has to be done in a way that can be maintained in its integrity, but the value of having that direct teaching is indispensable, and that's why the Torah is. That's one of the reasons the Torah is written, structured in such a way. Miriam, you want to say something?
Yes, thank you, Rabbi. I know we're over time, but I'm really. So how does this fit in with free will? Because the oral Torah has minority opinions. It has contradictions and discussions and arguments, and we've adapted a halakha from it, but how can we say that it was all predetermined what the halakha would be?
So, just in short, almost all the things that pertain to the Torah obligations have no machlokas. Almost entirely, almost all the things of machlokas and adaptation and so on are on rabbinic matters. In the Torah interpretations itself, in the Torah mitzvah, there's little to no machlokas. So those aspects are not in the Torah itself, but in the obligation that we have in every generation to make our society fit so that we can live by Torah. And so, many of the things that that we're all so accustomed to are actually not Torah obligations. For instance, candle lighting for Shabbos, 2 breads, a lechem mishnah, kiddush on a cup of wine. So the statement of kiddush is a Torah obligation, but kiddush over a cup of wine isn't, and the bracha isn't, and birkat hamazon benching isn't. There's an obligation to say blessing, but the words of the blessing aren't. So much of the structure we have is rabbinic in nature, and that's the development in time of the needs to maintain the structure of what we have. It's obviously a much bigger conversation, and probably worthy of its own classes, really, a series of classes on on understanding the Oraisa, the Rabbanan, biblical and rabbinic law, and its need and structure. The free will, yeah, and yes, I should do it. The free will aspect is our free will to live up to that. Whether it's rabbinic or Torah, the free will is ours to live up to whatever it is that we're going to be doing. And those are the struggles we all have on a given day. I mean, we make choices and we make commitments, and then we live up to some better and some worse, and that's the free will. And then the free will is what we choose to do, right? We choose to make some obligations for ourselves and choose not to take take others. That's the free will within there. The rest is really the commentary on that.
So Rabbi, from the Rambam's point of view, would we be looking at Pharaoh's magicians as like Ben and Teller?
Like illusionists? Would they be?
Yes, Rambam says it's essentially illusions, and somebody wrote this earlier. Any sufficient advancement in technology is indistinguishable from magic.
The Pharaoh's musicians were not operating in any kind of above nature reality.
According to Maimonides, according to Rambam. Ramban says they were utilizing just as there's a physical ability to manipulate nature, there's a metaphysical ability to manipulate the metaphysics of nature.